Well, I'm just going to sort of welcome you all, say a few thanks, and then I've got the profound honour of introducing Chine. Chine's going to speak for about 20-25 minutes, hopefully a bit longer if we can persuade her. Then I'll ask 3 or 4 questions, then we'll open it up to the floor. But thank you all for coming here early in the morning. I really appreciate it, and I can guarantee it's going to be worth your while because I'm really, really, really thrilled that Chine's here to join us today. And thank you for joining us online as well. I should wave. So first of all, in terms of just a few thanks for making today possible, while she is walking out as I currently say this, I'd like to thank Reverend Laura, who was up. So if someone could tell her I thanked her, that'd be great. As well as the wider St James's team for hosting us. We've been down here quite a few times, and there's always such a warm welcome for when we started coming here. There's obviously an amazing kids' corner, which my sons love, but also a tremendous community around this church that I think is of real benefit both to those who attend, but also the wider community. And the work which this church does to serve the wider community, I think, is an inspiration for me in the work I try and do, but also I think for a lot of us. And I think a lot of us are very thankful for the work we do. So I'd like to, on behalf of everyone, extend those thanks to Laura Jane and her team. I'd also like to thank Bryony for the poster advertising today's event, which maybe brought many of you here today as well. And also I should acknowledge both that it's both Nigerian Independence Day, so Chine has sacrificed celebrating that to come and celebrate it with us today. But also, obviously, today kicks off Black History Month, and we're particularly lucky that Black History Month in Barnet this year is bigger and better than ever, and that's largely thanks to Councillor Linda Lusingu, who's been heading that up. I wanted to sort of give you a pitch for why you should sort of join in some of the events that are coming up. But Linda, if you talk to her after this, will do a far better job of this, I'm sure, than I'll be able to. But I'm really excited about it. So this October marks the 35th Black History Month in the UK. And in Barnet, we're championing and celebrating the achievements of black people in the economic, cultural and political life in the UK. Across the borough, organisations are hosting an array of events and activities. And in July, full council voted to mark the occasion every single year. So this is the first of what we hope is an ongoing celebration of this event. And this is just the first of the many steps we're taking to promote diversity in the borough, which is, of course, incredibly important for the life we all lead here. If you'd like to find out more about it, there is a full events list on the council website. I'm sure also we can get Laura Jane to send it around as well. But please do take part in other events which are coming up this month, because we're really keen on it being a roaring success. Those are the notices. I'd also like to thank, I should also say, because we're co-hosting this, I'd like to thank Shipping Barnet Labour Party, who kindly agreed to host this. As well as being a councillor for this local area, one of the other hats I wear is I'm political education officer for Shipping Barnet Labour Party. And the reason I ran is because I was really excited at getting Chine up here as our inaugural speaker. So I'm both thankful for having been elected to that position and grateful for my colleagues for indulging me in inviting friends of mine who I think are amazing to come up and speak to you all on the topic. So without further ado, let me introduce Chine. She's written this incredible book. I have now both read it and listened to it on audiobook. I recommend both, but it's a phenomenal piece of work. For those who don't know Chine, and I'm sure she'll be too modest to walk you through her CV, so let me do a little bit of that, but inevitably it would take probably the entire time to go through everything, so I'm going to do some edited highlights if that's all right, Chine. But I got to know her when she was reading theology at Cambridge. We were there at the same time. Callow and impressionable youths, but it was clear to me at the time that Chine was going to go on and do amazing things, and lo and behold. After that, she was training as a newspaper journalist. It says on her book that she's now head of public engagement at Christian Aid, but she's also just got a fantastic new job as head of Theos think tank, who do incredible work. And I'm excited to see what direction Chine's going to take Theos in, so stay tuned to Theos. And also, you might know her from her contributions to radio. She does Thought for the Day on Radio 4, amongst a whole bunch of other things. This is her second book. Her first book about beauty standards and about how God sees us and what that means for sort of secular and contemporary ideas of beauty is also an incredible book too. Some of the people who have blurbed this book include David Lammy, Archbishop Justin Welby, Professor Maggie Dawn, Reverend Dr. Joel Edwards, Paula Goodett, and Michael Curry. I'm sure that Councillor Simon Radford doesn't quite compare. But if you don't want to take my word for it, take theirs. It's a fantastic book, and I'm really, really, really looking forward to having Chine speak to us all and tell her a little bit more about what's in the book, and then we'll have a few questions afterwards to explore some of the issues with you all. So thank you. Can you all put your hands together for Chine, please?
Hello. Good morning, everyone. I was having a very profoundly weird moment there with Simon introducing me, having known him since I was 18. Yeah, it's just a strange experience, but really privileged to be invited here today to speak to you all. Thank you for coming out on a Saturday morning. Thank you for joining online. I was going to say thank you to my husband, who's looking after the children in the corner, but they've obviously gone for a walk. I was going to keep my eye to see if the baby was sleeping, but I don't have to worry about that now. So I'm going to talk through just some of the themes that come out in the book. If you've read it or if you've not, I will have some on sale at the end as well, and look forward to hearing your comments and questions afterwards. So the first time I encountered God in my image was in reading a book called The Shack. I wouldn't take all my theology from this book, but like millions of others, I had been reading this book, and it was a New York Times best-selling book by Canadian author William P. Young. And it tells the story of a man who, torn apart by unspeakable tragedy, encounters God in three persons in a shack in the middle of nowhere. And in this book, God is represented in three persons, one by the Holy Spirit in the form of an Asian woman, Jesus in the form of a Middle Eastern man, and Papa, God the Father, in the form of a curvy black woman. And those who had read the book were careful not to give spoilers, so when I arrived at the pages of the description of God the Father, Papa, in the pages of this book, I was left open-mouthed, because I'd never imagined God to be portrayed in this way. I remember at the time calling my mum, who had read the book before me. We were excited and we were overwhelmed, but at points we were also rendered speechless. Because in this book, God looked just like us. And when the Hollywood film came out a few years later, Papa was played by Octavia Spencer, who ironically had played Maid Minnie Jackson in the civil rights film The Help. And seeing her on screen brought it home to us even more. Here she was, a black woman playing the Almighty. It's hard to describe what this meant to us, because it wasn't something that we had ever called for or campaigned for. It's not something that we had ever imagined possible. But there was something really profound in seeing, for even in that short period, a God in whom we really could physically see ourselves. So rewind back then to my undergraduate degree at Cambridge studying theology, where the thought of a black female depiction of God would have seemed completely alien. In the preface of my book, I write about how, in this place at university, I had attempted to present a simple reading of theology as a series of intellectual arguments, listed one after the other. This theologian thought this, and that theologian thought that. Like the journalist that I had wanted to be, I had attempted to take myself out of the story, out of the theological story. I presented few of my own thoughts, feeling them to be unimportant and potentially distracting in writing academic essays about the nature of God. And if I'm honest, I've spent much of my life doing this, making myself smaller, accommodating the expectations of how others want the world to be. While patriarchal influences draw a box in which women must sit and conform, white supremacy quietens the unique voice of the black experience. And there isn't room for both. And perhaps I should have listened much earlier to the lesson that my Cambridge supervisor taught me, that my voice matters. Who I am matters. Not merely in the social justice or political sense, but because when it comes to theology, the personal account is just as important as the historic, academic, or intellectual. In the same way, my life experiences also matter. And I think this is arguably more true of theological explorations than it is of any others. Since God can't be seen or touched in a physical sense, we can only experience God spiritually, in our inner beings, and our experience of God can then only be relayed through our words, our speech, a translation exercise taking place in which communicating our experience of God can't escape being shaped by our histories, by our social contexts, by our genders, by our racial backgrounds, our individual stories. It's these personal stories that shape our knowledge of the divine. How can God be revealed except through the variety of different personal stories and physical realities and cultural contexts in which humans experience God's presence? As 17th century philosopher John Locke wrote, God, when he makes the prophet, does not unmake the man. But the problem I have, however, is that for most of my life, having grown up in the church, the picture that's been presented is that God values some attributes, namely whiteness and maleness, as supreme. In my 30-plus years of mainly white majority church attendance, I felt in many ways other and inferior as both black and a woman. So in writing God is not a white man, I came face to face with the trauma of the lie that the church has perpetuated over years about people who look like me. So it's some of those ideas about how we experience God and how the church puts forward a picture of who God is that I explore in the book. So I want to take you back to the writing of the book. And I'm taking you back to the first few months of the original lockdown in 2020. Remember that? We were in the middle of a global pandemic. We were queuing for hours to get into the supermarket. We were terrified of an invisible virus. In those first few days, I was seeing newspaper headlines filled with pictures of male doctors who looked a little bit like my dad, who was himself on the front line as a surgeon working within the NHS. And at work at Christian Aid, as I was then, I had been promoted into my dream job in one of the most uncertain times for charities, managing a big team and furlough. And then at home, a nursery was closed, and I was juggling childcare with my husband, creating 2-hourly rotas to look after our then 2-year-old son. We were dealing with fussy eating and toilet training. I'm just sharing how stressful it was at the time. This was all in the background. I'm trying to explain that this was the most stressful time. And on top of that, I had 6 months to write God is Not a White Man. And in many ways, though unbelievably stressful, this was absolutely the best time to be writing it, because I was full of rage about all the injustice against people who look like me in 2020, yes, but also over centuries. We saw then the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement following George Floyd's murder, and it made us all ask questions about racial justice that we hadn't been asking so openly in my lifetime. So that was the context in which I was writing the book, when all of this stuff was happening and all these things were coming out. But if I'm being honest, by the time I watched George Floyd's murder on my phone, I had already become well acquainted with Black Death. I'd come to expect the brutalization of black bodies from a very young age, through observing and watching how black people cautiously navigated our way through different contexts, and witnessing how we were received, the clutched handbag, the subtle crossing of the street, how we were represented in art, in film, in entertainment. Blackness had long been associated with sorrow and suffering and death in my mind, long before I came to really understand what those things meant. I grew up with on-screen portrayals of the violence committed against black people during the transatlantic slave trade and beyond, by watching things including Roots, or 12 Years a Slave, or Django Unchained, or The Birth of a Nation, or Glory. These films have throughout the years reinforced this idea that black people should expect violence and danger. And to some, whether consciously or unconsciously, A black person's body is seen as no different from a piece of property with which the owner can do whatever they wish. James Cone, the theologian, writes in a book called The Cross and the Lynching Tree, the people of the South don't think any more of killing the black fellows than you would think of killing a flea. We live in the shadow of the days in which black people were the property and white people were the owners, when black bodies were rendered worthless. Black bodies like George Floyd's. The reactions that I have to these stories, past and present, are often visceral and physical. I recall standing in my kitchen, shaking after doing some research for my book, and being hit with what felt like relentless accounts of the violence against black people that had been justified throughout the centuries. As I was reminded of the inhumane conditions that enslaved people kidnapped from their homes in African nations were kept in. I could almost smell the blood, the salty tears and the sweat in the belly of those slave ships, and hear the cries of those people who had gone from complete freedom to this nightmarish existence. Some of them didn't even survive the Middle Passage, while some longed for death rather than the present reality in which they found themselves and the future reality that would become their tragic story. I shook as I recalled the story of Reese Taylor. Taylor was on her way back to her husband and young child after attending church in September 1944 with her friend Fanny Daniel, when a car drove up and stopped next to them on the road. Inside the car were 7 men, including a US Army Private Herbert Lovett, who, after falsely accusing Taylor of cutting a white boy in the town earlier in the evening, forced her into the car at gunpoint. They then drove her to a patch of trees nearby, forcibly undressed her and assaulted her. I shook as I recalled how I had learned that physician J. Marion Sims, the celebrated father of modern gynecology, had practiced his surgeries without anesthesia on enslaved women, Lucy, Anarcha, Betsy, and others whose names we do not know. The past 400 years of black history is a story of brutalization and violence. And it's hard for people like me living centuries after some of those atrocities and an ocean away from the worst of it to separate ourselves from the cruelty experienced by those who have gone before us. When I read or hear stories of the rape of black women, the experimentation on enslaved black people's bodies for medical advancement, the whipping, the lynching, the killings, it's sometimes as if I'm experiencing the violence myself. Monica Williams, a professor and psychologist, describes this as vicarious trauma. She argues that race-based stress can be triggered through viewing racial discrimination, brutality, violence, or aggression through a third party, such as social media or watching the news, and suggests that racism should be included as one of the causes of PTSD. This vicarious trauma is both present and historic. When I see another black person killed, I experience it vicariously. And it also reminds me of the centuries of similar instances of violence against black bodies, those with whose lives I feel a strong bond that stretches out from the past through to the present day. Since Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, the brutal murders of black men and women in majority white contexts have not disappeared. In recent years, we've seen many new hashtags on social media. As actor Will Smith said in 2016, racism isn't getting worse, it's getting filmed. We've seen far too many social media tags containing the names of black people who found themselves the latest in a long line of victims facing violence, brutalization, and death as a result of a pervasive white supremacist culture, one that renders black bodies at risk. We saw during COVID how black bodies were disproportionately being affected by the virus. We realised that despite centuries of apparent progress, that black lives and black bodies didn't matter after all. In the discussions with fellow Black Britons following George Floyd's death, I noticed that there was a common thread. When we watched George Floyd being murdered, we saw our own necks on the line. That sense of vicarious trauma can cross the Atlantic, just as it can stretch throughout the decades. I found it interesting that some people wonder why it is that Black people in the UK take it so personally when Black people in the US are killed. I believe that there's something about us seeing ourselves in our American brothers and sisters precisely because we see ourselves in other Black people everywhere. Close bonds form between oppressed groups in a way that can't really be understood or explained outside those groups. In my country of birth, Nigeria, there's a strong sense of communal ties that can't be broken. And it's expressed well in the Zulu language of Southern Africa. Many of us have heard the term Ubuntu, I am because we are. We see ourselves in George Floyd, just as we saw ourselves in Breonna Taylor and Stephen Lawrence and Rodney King and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and lynched Black men and women. But I think it's important to say that there can be beauty found in the pain, not to glorify the suffering of Black people, but there can be beauty. As James Cone again writes, the beauty in Black existence is as real as the brutality, and the beauty prevents the brutality from having the final word. Black suffering, he writes, needs radical and creative voices, prophetic advocates who can tell brutal and beautiful stories of how oppressed Black people survived with a measure of dignity when they were not meant to. Who are we? Why are we here? And what must we do to achieve our full humanity in a world that denies it? The history of Black bodies at the hands of white supremacy has been marked by violence and brutalization and untimely death. It's a story that's retold and repeated in each generation. From the tragic accounts of the deaths of those who didn't survive the Middle Passage, to those unarmed human beings, loved by God, who were beaten, shot, or suffocated to death at the hands of those who were supposed to protect them. It's some of these questions around Black dignity and Black suffering that I explore in God is Not a White Man, which begins with these questions around the literal depictions of God throughout the centuries as a way in to explore who society holds as less than. An omnipotent, all-powerful God represented as white. What does that say about white supremacy and patriarchy in the world and in the church? So in writing the book, I wanted to give voice to the experience of what it's like to be both Black and female in a world that is in many ways designed to elevate both whiteness and maleness. I wanted to explore the effects of the literal depictions of God as both white and male. God as an old man who looks a bit like Father Christmas sitting in a cloud, and Jesus as a sandy-haired kind of hippie figure. These images that all of us have grown familiar with if you look at most depictions of God and Jesus in art throughout history. It's been really interesting to hear people's reactions to the title of the book. It seems obvious to most people who know anything or believe anything about God. Well, of course God isn't a man, and of course God isn't white. But if you look at centuries of theology and practice within the church, you see white supremacy and patriarchy writ large on the walls. And that pervasive message that seeps in when you look at church leadership or the theological voices that are listened to, or even the very notion itself of Christianity as being a white European religion. Of course, while we might think it's obvious that God is not a white man, the practices of the church have suggested otherwise. My book isn't just about the literal depictions of God, but really I use it as a metaphor and an intended double meaning to say that not only is God not a white man, but white men are not gods. And explore how white supremacy is pervasive when we explore lots of different things, from the feminist movement to interracial relationships, through my own marriage, through international development, and how it's also pervasive in the church. But a large part of what I explore in the book is about these images, and how these images we have of God are really important and reflect how we see ourselves, but also how society treats people who are different in some way. And white Jesus is the logical consequence of a world that values whiteness as supreme. If you think about the most famous artworks picturing Jesus throughout the centuries, from Salvador Dali's Christ of St John of the Cross to Holman Hunt's Light of the World to Leonardo da Vinci's Salvator Mundi, each of these depict Jesus as white with long hair and a beard. If I'm being honest, this is the only image I have of Jesus. I'm working on it, but a consequence of having seen thousands of images of Christ represented in this way throughout my life. So unseeing and reimagining white Christ in the minds of believers is almost impossible. In a world where whiteness is power, then of course an omnipotent, all-knowing God must be white, because God could be nothing else. White supremacy doesn't just come in the cape of a Ku Klux Klan member, but in the depictions of white Jesus and the subtle words that seem to portray this idea that white is right. White supremacy can come not just in literal chains and shackles, but in the narrow definition of what and who is beautiful. White supremacy can come in simply a lack of welcome to anyone who is not white. A Christianity that is more focused on maintaining the status quo of white superiority, as if whiteness is something that God sees as worthy of protecting, is not the Christianity of Jesus Christ. It bears no resemblance to the New Testament's critique of empire and religious leaders who see themselves as pious, yet ignore the plight of the outcasts, the wounded, or the subjugated. Depictions of white Jesus portray this white supremacy. Nadia Bolz-Weber, an American church leader, wrote recently, "The endless depictions of God as a white guy aren't just boring, they're blasphemous in their narrow specificity. Because God's image is seen and comprehended only in the mind-blowing diversity of all human forms. The wildness of human variation isn't a mistake. It is a sign of the glory of God. And yet we made it a sign for the value and ranking of people. Leave it to humans," she writes, "to take a gift and turn it into a curse." Before we can go into questions, I want to end with a story that I think helps us recognize that each of us is made in the image of God. And it's a letter that I wrote for my eldest son, and it's at the end of the book. "You were 2 years old when you started to understand that the world was made up of difference, and that people came in a variety of shades and colours. You knew far earlier than I thought you would that I am black and your father is white. And I wondered if you were confused about that, whether it meant anything to you. I wondered whether any children had pulled your hair or excluded you, or made you feel like you did not belong. I wanted to wrap you up in love and shut out a world that ever made you question your worth. When we asked you what colour you were, you looked puzzled and answered, grey. Grey, like an overcast day. And we knew right then that we would have to work hard to protect you from a world that might make you feel disappointed in yourself, one that might make you long for summer when your smile was already a sunbeam. You will always be our summer. So your dad told you that you were not grey, but golden brown. And your eyes lit up. You saw in golden brown your own radiance and worth. In golden brown, we saw the image of God in you. And God said that grey, black, white, all golden brown. It was always there.